Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. Our subject is the Health Silk Road and where it is leading. If you remember, we had in 2020, already in March, April, we launched a series of articles and webinars on the Health Silk Road with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we had discussed, China, after it managed to control the pandemic at home, it's launched an international campaign of medical aid and other kinds of under the title of the Health Silk Road. The Health Silk Road, as we discussed earlier, was launched in 2017 with the 60 nations signing to it in Beijing. And also the World Health Organization was included in that. And one of the key elements of that Health Silk Road is, of course, the work on the Belt and Road Initiative and the infrastructure improvements that are needed to make sure that we have healthcare coverage in a universal sense. Now, in April this year, we had a very interesting podcast with our guest today, Henry Tillman, chairman of the China Investment Research in the UK. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. We have also been following your work on the internet. Very fascinating matters you take up, especially with facts and numbers. As our audience, if don't remember, what we discussed, you and I, in April in the podcast on April 15th, is that we took up many aspects of the Health Silk Road, its origins, but also within the COVID-19 pandemic, what was going on. We discussed financial matters. We discussed China's medical assistance to other countries. We also discussed investments that were being made both into China, but also from China in other countries, because it goes both ways. It's not only China doing things, other countries are also investing in China. And one of the most fascinating things we discussed was also the evolution of the Chinese biotech industry. But the thing is, what we saw developing very, very rapidly, which is now becoming a signum of the way the Chinese do things, that the whole Health Silk Road process was advancing very quickly within months. Now, since our discussion in April, you have brought into light a breathtaking development, even going much faster into especially the question of vaccines, since we have had this whole situation with now people think that this is the light at the end of the tunnel. Now we have vaccinated people all over Europe, the United States, but the failure to cover everyone have created a situation where we have new strains developing in other hotspots in the world, like in India, potentially in Africa, because as the chairman of the World Health Organization, the director, said, unless everybody's safe, nobody is safe. And that's where we have to take the discussion now. And I think, Henry, you are a great help to trace the facts and the numbers where things are heading with the Health Silk Road, but also China's strategy. So the first question is that we have, on the question of the vaccine specifically, we have bottlenecks in production and distribution. We have contradicting strategies. We have also an international initiative with the COVAX to make sure that everybody is covered. So you have both published and discussed elsewhere your discoveries in this sense. So can you please walk us through what has happened since April, especially with the vaccine production and distribution situation?
Sure. Thank you very much for that brief review. You're correct that when we spoke in April, it was really to review what we did with the Chinese think tank last year, the SIIS, and ourselves to track all the movements in 2020, particularly the economics associated with it. So that's correct. So since then, we have this summer, beginning in April, actually, with SIIS and Shanghai University, we began looking at the developments, as you've just talked about, with vaccines, distribution, all of the things you just raised. That paper is almost done. It's been completed, but hasn't been published yet. So what I'm talking about today is what's in that paper, which is to be, which should be published very, very soon once there's sign-offs on it. It's our firm with SIIS and Shanghai University again. So let me start with sort of the early part of that and work our way through the last several months. So the first part of that, you're bang on, that it's both WHO and Airfinity have both come up with a number that says around 11 billion people, 11 billion vaccines need to be available for the world to reach herd immunity. That's the number that both WHO and Airfinity came up with. Let me talk about some of the manufacturing and distribution challenges around that. So from a manufacturing point of view, the West can be expected, as estimated by their own forecast, to produce roughly 28 billion doses of COVID vaccines in 2021 and 2022. Those are mostly led by North American-based and European-based manufacturing companies. That's 28 billion. And the Chinese, both this year and next year, are scheduled to produce 8.5 billion of doses total. The most recent joint venture in May of this year between Germany, as you said before, about both continents working together, the German BioNTech, Pfizer, and Fosun adds 1 more billion next year to China's total. So roughly 28 billion for the West, 9.5 billion for China. Now, you can see by the numbers that China itself cannot populate, cannot reach the 11 billion for the world. That's it. It takes the world to do this. So what you saw early, and of course, India was supposed to be 1 billion of that as well. But then India had its own issues with its own spike, which happened in April and into May, and therefore they had to stop, if you will, distributing what they were going to distribute, which we'll come on to in a second. But in addition to those numbers I just gave you, there is leakage as well. So India, as you had a problem with the ability to export the rest of this year, at least the rest of this year. Then, as you rightfully point out, through the entire period, the USA has had serious vaccines lapse. They go to waste. I think the most recent numbers I saw earlier this month was around 125,000 doses in Alabama alone, in one state alone. And I think I saw a 60 million number from J&J where there's a problem with that. There was a problem with some distribution into Africa where those were lapsed. They tried to stretch the period of time where the effectiveness still lapsed. And even as early as late as, I suppose it's June, the African Union were saying, yes, the EU is supposed to help us with this, but they're not helping us with this. And so what you had at that point in time through about May was, roughly speaking, an estimate of roughly 2.6 billion excess doses being held by the USA, by EU, by Canada, UK. That's spare dosage they have for themselves. Yes. Then you rightfully point out, then it starts, and so that at that point in time, our study was looking at global governance and globally working together. That's where the study was supposed to be and actually was designed. But then you rightly point
designed
out,
by
what we originally said, we would look at a global governance such that what could we do as a country, as a world, to develop what could be, to make the world bring it back to normalcy by the end of 2022. So how could these places all work together? So it's a fair question. And then what happened was the global governance didn't, a concept was a concept only. It never happened in practicality. So back to your question, maybe we could talk about how that sort of unraveled country by country. So the first of those, if that's okay with you, or
yeah, I mean, you might show slides if you want, or
to. I didn't prepare the slides for today. I could talk about the numbers, as you know. I have an ability to memorize numbers. Unfortunately.
All right.
Anyway, so the answer is that each of these countries started going to their own way. So India was originally going to distribute 1 billion, as I said before, doses of. They're the world's leading manufacturing in the Serum Institute, and they were in the process of. I think they only got probably 60 million doses of their billion distributed into several countries when they had their own problem. So there was huge disruption in countries such as Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, to name a few, where certain people over age 65 had the jab, only got one jab, didn't get a second jab, so major disruption. And as part of that, to be factual, India was supposed to be the front end of the Quad. Yes, and therefore there were lots of political discussions about
the Quad. That's the strategic alliance of the U.S., Australia, Japan, India, and so on, and the so-called Indo-Pacific.
Yes, I will leave those things to your capable hands.
Okay. Yeah. No, I just that people know what the reference is to the Quad.
So there were all kinds of issues. If you don't do this, you can't have the Quad protection, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. We won't waste everyone's time, but I can assure you that that was happening. So, but that all fell over when India imploded, and India then went to a point where they were supposed to be the front end of this, the world's greatest manufacturer of vaccines, to implode or to keep it to themselves. So suddenly that collapsed, and so that was in April, and by May they had no more ability to distribute those vaccines, and they were supposed to be again the world leader. About 1.5 months later, on the 10th of June, the USA responded by saying that they were going to spend $34 billion to buy vaccines and to distribute those, and those vaccines would be 500 million vaccines to be distributed both this year and by middle of next year. Pfizer and US-led vaccines, and in their model that would be purchased by the US government, by US manufacturers, and then parceled out, whether it's through COVAX or through the US government as well. But that was only 500 million doses. And then 2 days later, under the G7, you saw the G7 meet to say that they would distribute 870 million doses. In addition, put more money into purchasing more doses. So ultimately, those two together were 1.3 billion doses, yes, plus the plan to do another 1 billion plus doses over the next year by the EU buying it, distributing it. So of the 28 billion doses they're going to manufacture in the next year till the end of 2022, the EU and the USA and the Quad, if you want to call it the whole put, will be distributing roughly 2.5 billion. And that's nowhere near satisfying the 11 billion need for the world. And so there's a huge brouhaha all over the press by saying the G7 didn't deliver, what are we going to do, et cetera, et cetera. 2 weeks later, only 2 weeks later, China came up with what I consider to be a highly innovative, and you would say something moving at breakneck pace to be able to, if you will, shrink.
Was that in June this year? Or?
It was June 23rd. It was,
okay.
It was the BRI Vaccine Partnership, and that partnership includes only 29 countries at launch, representing 2.7 billion people, which is representing 35% of the world's population. And so that was launched at the end of June. Again, less than 2 weeks after the G7 didn't move. We then, before I get into that, we then, as an interim measure, we then made an issue of this at a webinar in Asia, where we outed the West for not distributing this excess, and many of the press have picked this up. So there was pressure provided even by the Washington Post and New York Times for some of this spare dosage to be released, although those spare dosages still didn't get anywhere near filling that vaccine gap. Which then brings me to the Chinese proposed solution. So again, it's 29 countries. Most of those at the start are Asian countries. There's some in Latin America, and there's also some in Africa, but most of those are Asian countries from North to South Asia. And they started with 29, but we've already seen developments even much faster than that. But let's start talking about the concept first. It's just, you might think about this from people that follow you that talk about investors, because we're in the business of finding Western capital to invest in the BRI projects. Because
yeah, I mean, it's important to understand the strategy. What is the strategy, but how it is implemented? That's
right. Well, I think that the strategy is quite clear. The strategy from China is to make these countries vaccine independent by the end of 2022, because it was really hugely disruptive when India imploded, because they were in the process of vaccinating these people, and it just dried up. So number one, and so I don't think anyone wants to be in a position to have to rely on the USA or the G7 or India or one supplier, because you put yourself at risk. So the goal is to make them vaccine independent domestically by into 2022.
So that means that they will be able to produce vaccines domestically.
Correct.
Those countries.
And I'll walk you through both produce and distribute.
Okay.
And the second piece of that, thank you for asking, is that because the West dominates, the top four dominate the production of these current vaccines, they're able to raise price consistently and have done so throughout the year, including the last fortnight. In the UK here, our last order saw a 25% increase on prices from Pfizer in the last, that's even this month. So the goal here is, and so I think we cite in the materials you're talking about that certain African countries are paying $29 for a dose, and if you get it, it costs $3 to produce, if not less.
And that, of course, is huge profits for the big corporations.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because I think some of your listeners might not only are people hoarding these vaccines. Let me share with you some numbers. The market cap of one of the companies in America that actually took the money from Trump went from 9 billion in March of 2020 to 163 billion in August of this year.
In capital or
market cap?
Market cap.
That's 16 times your money in 18 months. And the CEO paid himself $98 million for 2020 compensation, common stock award. The CEO of Pfizer took 21.5 million cash plus 5 million shares of Pfizer for his 2020 compensation. And the CEO of BioNTech in Germany now has private net worth of $15 billion in a year and a half. So this is the amount of money being made. And so you also it's a good reminder, when we first started looking at this, and it's in our 2020 study, which I mentioned with you before, we talked to a number of merchant banks, larger investment banks, and thought, what would the numbers be for this year in terms of revenue for vaccine? And this was in September 2020. And the biggest estimate, the highest estimate we saw, I think, was from Credit Suisse at 20 billion. And now we know this year it'll be 100 billion. It's 70 billion already to date this year. So it's a very fast growing market. Yes, just for those major players, and with a smaller extent.
But that comes at the expense of the fact that no nation in Africa or in the developing nation can afford to pay so much for the vaccines. And so we are not here applauding the success of these major multinational corporations, but the fact that these numbers show that there is a money aspect to the whole situation, which is, it's in a sense, it's a bit repulsive for me. But in any way, that these are the facts, these are the numbers. So anyway, so that's
our Prime Minister here in the UK called it greed.
Greed.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson called it greed, but
yeah.
you could decide what you want to. If I'm using his word.
Anyway, so if we go back to the China strategy with these 29 countries or whichever countries are in the BRI Vaccine Partnership.
Yes. So the goal here, so if you do them up, so you can also know. So let me show you the gap still. So basically, in the interim here, we know there's about 2 billion doses around the world that's gone out so far. We know that China's pledged 2 billion. We know there's another 1.5 billion coming from G7, which haven't been distributed so far. So you're around 6 billion of the world's 11 billion. So where do you fill that 5 billion? And let's assume of the 2.5 billion cushion, 1 billion of that goes. So you're still 4 billion short globally. How do you fill the gap? If the West doesn't release this stuff, and assume they won't release this, and China can't go any faster, although capital markets helps them grow faster, you've got to fill the gap. So the answer is this 29 country vaccine partnership. Now let me, and you asked the right question, which is how does this work? And the answer is in each, so currently there are 4 vaccines by China that are accepted and used in various different countries, although there are 18 others being trialed. Yes, and since that we wrote this piece, which is the first week of July, 3 more vaccine companies have raised capital. And since then, not only have we seen that, some of these are quite innovative companies. Yes, and so one of those has higher, it's not yet released, it's being trialed in New Zealand and being trialed in Austria. It has higher efficacy rates than AstraZeneca and Pfizer.
And these are Chinese vaccines.
Yes, Chinese vaccine. And China also has an mRNA vaccine that they're trialing in Mexico right now, which is a direct competitor, of course, to a Pfizer vaccine. So this is how fast this is moving. But back to where we were in July, because when this was first announced, to your point of how this is breakneck speed of growth. The answer is the Chinese, unlike the USA, even though they funded these vaccine companies, pharmacy companies, they can't release, they don't have the IP to release. The IP is still held. In China, the IP is transferred to local countries. Yes?
Yeah, you mean the copyright, so to speak, of the vaccine itself.
Well, they use the vaccines. They actually use the vaccines to manufacture them in their home country.
Yeah.
Yes.
So because the Chinese president said last year, when we have developed our vaccine, we will make it public good. We will not keep it as a monopoly. So they stated their word.
Well, one of the reasons I do what I do every day is because I tracked for years. The Rand Corporation used to say that China kept only 20% of its promises. So I, for a number of years, tracked what President Xi said and how long it took to materialize. And every quarter, it improved every quarter. So I'm a great believer when he says something, it happens. Full stop. Yes, yeah. without exception. Anyway, back to your point, if I will. So the way this works is they choose a local partner. The local partner then manufactures it with care and with training from China, and then they distribute it locally. Let's start with the simple one country distribution. Now, now it's not easy to do this. So as you will appreciate, just because you're a vaccine specialist, it doesn't mean you can build COVID-19 vaccines. So Pakistan has had a vaccines lab for many, many years, a regional lab, fantastic, an NIH lab. And yet it took Sinovac to get on a plane with its executives to fly into Pakistan to teach them how to build this, the technology, the skill sets, how to build this. Yes. So and while this is ramping out so quickly, yes, there may be it may be stretched to have adequate number of people to train in each of these countries to do this. But the concept remains the same, which is IP rights, vaccine rights, go local players produce it, distribute it, and keep the funds in the country. Yes, so it's for the good of the country and for the strength of the country going forward. It is not purchasing it from Pfizer, dropping it like manna from heaven on the ground. That's actually, yes, being built there for that. Now, so this can, but what the structure of this is quite tricky because some of these partners are publicly traded companies For example, Morocco is publicly traded, Algeria is publicly traded, Pakistan is publicly traded. Some are government SOE, local partners,
Yeah.
and some
Egypt also, they started, it went quick from signing to production.
Well,
It went quick this summer.
And we'll come on to that in a second. I just want to make this point, but you're always one step ahead of me, my friend. Anyway, at least one.
I'm sorry.
At least one step ahead. Anyway, so therefore, some of these you can move quickly as an investor to appreciate some of this, but we're very, very careful with this information. We don't want investors to charge in to make a pile of money on something that's for the good of the country, when in fact China is doing this to help the good of the country. But also in most of these countries, it's a build. So for example, Morocco is a public company, but it's a build. It's a 400 million build to get it to this the girth, the size that it needs to get to. I think the number in Serbia is 157 million plant to build it. So it's going to take time. And it's going to be patient, because now I'm going to come into your point, which is it takes time to get this ramped up. So just because Egypt has already has manufacturing this, it probably is manufacturing around 20 or 30 million per year at this stage, and needs to get to 100 to 150 or 200. And to give you some kind of numbers, Pakistan's at 36 million a year production on a run rate basis right now. But let's say 220 million times 80% is 170 million times 3.
That's the population. Is Pakistan's 220 million. In Egypt, it's 100 million people. So you need lots and lots of vaccine.
Times 3.
Yeah.
Times 3. Yeah. So in essence, this is a very fast moving fund. So it's to fund these things, to train people locally. They found the partners to train the people locally, to ramp up the production, to get it in a position by the end of 2020 where this is done. So that's why you say it's breakneck. Because if you think about this, and if you start summing this up, so for example, the UAE started at 24 million doses a year run rate in Q2 this year. They expect to be a 200 million run rate next year. Mm-hmm. So if you start looking at 100 and 200 million run rates in many of these countries, and by the way, of the 29, only 8 have really developed that fast. The rest are outside the 29. There are 10 new ones that are also developing. Yes. So it's highly conceivable that that gap that we're talking about is filled by the end of 2022 with these partnerships. That's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, that's amazing. And also, I mean, in terms of the cost to the world, and the control of the vaccines, the monopoly, which we have seen here in mostly Western companies, the big profits they're making. So I think the Chinese strategy, as a side effect of it, it will break the monopoly over vaccines, but also push down the price of vaccines, which should be a human right, not a commodity for those who can afford it. Because if we don't vaccinate and treat everyone in the world and prevent it, it will come back to hit us. This is something maybe those CEOs don't really pay attention to. But
I can't comment on greed. It's not part of my ethos.
No. Anyway, but the thing is that the Chinese strategy, if we go back to the Chinese strategy, now I read an article in the Asia Times, which says, what is behind China's so-called vaccine strategy? There are many silly geopolitical points, but he says one point, the last point he says, is that China wants to take over the global biotech production industry. It's developing its own biotech, but it's going to create markets where its own production becomes dominant. Now, China is helping these countries. These are not joint ventures. These are
they're joint ventures. They are literally joint ventures with local participants, led by the locals. That's correct.
Because that takes us to the next point of the, not only developing China's biotech technology, which the last podcast you told us how it's so fast, forward developed from nothing, almost nothing in 10 years. But now it's becoming a global player. So some people see this as a threat, while others can see that this is one way of enabling developing nations to become self-reliant, self-sufficient in not only vaccines, but also in other types of medical medicines or medical equipment and other things which are, there's a monopoly. I remember
Healthcare.
many years
Right.
ago, Vice President Al Gore threatened the president of South Africa because South Africa were producing unlicensed AIDS medicines because they need them. And he threatened South Africa with economic sanctions. So they have to buy the AIDS medicine very expensive from US producers rather than producing them themselves. So this is the kind of, the developing nations versus but this is all one humanity. We need these things available in every nation. We need a global healthcare system so we don't get these pandemics and terrible things. But how do you view this point of if this is a smart Chinese move, or is it for the benefit of mankind?
I want to make sure you learn a little bit more, because it's moving more away from that into really market moves. Because as I mentioned before, China has already come up with, and I didn't make to mention this yet. So remember, I just told you the number of, I think there are 8 or 9 producers in the West. China has already 4 and 3 more behind it, and 18 in trials. So China could have 25 different vaccines here by the end of next year. And some of these vaccines are pretty forward. The recall I just mentioned to you, which IPO'd this summer, already has better numbers on these variants.
Right.
And number 1 and number 2, China has also made its first move now into commercial, not government to government, to commercial. So Malaysia now has a partnership. A Malaysian company has a partnership with a Chinese company to do it at the commercial level, not at the G2G level. So that's happening there. And then, of course, it's competitive elsewhere in the world. So, for example, I can't verify this, I learned that the UK government has come up with some kind of approval for a pre-blockage, basically. So no need for a vaccine, which also could transform the whole industry, right? Taking drug, pre-drug. But that number, to do that right now, I think is not cost effective. So this is becoming market oriented. I think that what I would say is, yes, that's true that I said those words that 10 years ago that the Chinese biotech industry didn't exist. That's not true now. They continue to produce more and more talent and raise more and more capital. But I'm just showing the 2 most recent of these are something the U.S. hasn't done, or Europe hasn't done. So it's their ability to make technological change. It has nothing to do with China. It has a lot to do with those scientists. It's becoming more market driven in this next level. But certainly, what's happening here, I believe, is something that China's looked at for years. As you know, we discussed before, China started providing healthcare to people in Africa in 1963. If I have to look at a difference between China and many Western cultures, the most important thing to China is a human life, preserving human life. Where I look at the West, I don't see that as based upon the numbers we're talking about, not a key driver. Yes, so I do think they've been thinking about doing something like this for quite a long time. Variations on it, but it's just nothing of this scale.
So I mean, if you don't have something more on this strategy on the BRI Vaccine Partnership to tell us, but just to conclude that what China is doing is that it's using its own vaccines, its own capital, its own capabilities to spread the production and distribution of vaccines, existing and coming vaccines, in many parts of the world. So nations can become independent, and also, for example, nations can also help each other. Egypt can help its neighbors, Morocco can help its neighbors, and so on and so forth. But also that a side effect of that is that the monopoly over vaccine production, which Western companies have, and their ability to decide the market price will be diminished in a sense. And I think this is good for humanity.
I agree with you.
It's not good for the shareholders the whole time, but the shareholders already got a huge cut. But
depends on which shareholders, because there's other shareholders, biotech firms, Chinese biotech firms, doing quite well. Maybe one more piece I didn't really mention. You know, we're a merchant bank, we raise capital, and we're not talking to any Chinese investors for these capital raises. Actually, we're talking to Western investors.
Okay,
European asset managers want to be a part of this, or longer term players, or multilateral banks. I can't name names, but there are multilateral banks that are interested in this. Because China, this is not about capital appreciation, but I don't underestimate the wisdom and the capitalistic nature within the thinking within China. Because if you look at some of these hubs, it's my view that, and we already know factually, the UAE is now responsible for UAE, for Serbia, for Hungary, for Belarus, and this week, surprise of surprises, Philippines have taken the UAE vaccine, which is really a Sinopharm vaccine, but basically with an Islamic angle to it. Yes, and so we expect these hubs like this, and these could be major public companies in 12 months. Pakistan, Egypt, as you say, Indonesia, Chile. Yes, these are
South Africa.
South Africa. Well, actually, South Africa already has 2 U.S. partners already. So China's a little slow. South Africa's the Johnson & Johnson was the first one of those.
Okay, so I mean, this is our mission in the Belt and Road Institute, is that this is not about the East versus the West. It's not about China. Our mission is to make sure that Europe and the United States understand the importance of working together with China, with Russia, with other nations, of course, around the BRI as a concept, which has been successful. So this is not to say that we are for one and not the other, but we see certain interesting developments, how nations work, and we can see what is the method, how it's functioning, and if it works or not. And that's why you are, as you say, you are not directing your information to Chinese investors. You have nothing to do with them. You are directing your information to European and Western investors, that they might be enlightened to understand what's going on in these matters. So this is exactly also our mission. We are not a nonprofit. We are not a business. We spread ideas. We make discussions. So anyway, so that brings us to our final closing points, which is unavoidable today to discuss Afghanistan. Of course, I have written, and we had many things on our website on Afghanistan, even in Chinese media, on the importance of integrating Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative as a first step to peace and security. By embracing Afghanistan, by the neighboring countries, by China, Russia, India, Pakistan, all these countries should work together to help Afghanistan rebuild its economy, while the Afghanis are sitting down together and discussing how to solve their own problems, which I think the right thing to do. Nobody should solve their problems for them. But what the world can contribute to Afghanistan is to help improve the living conditions and this horrible suffering for 40 years and the health aspect of the Afghani people. I mean, I hope Europe and the United States don't stop providing humanitarian aid as they are threatening. It has nothing to do with the Taliban. This aid goes to the people, and it should continue. The Taliban, they have their own resources. But if we look at the health conditions, even after 20 years of US, NATO existence, there $2.2 trillion spent, we still have Afghanistan in terms of healthcare is one of the worst cases in the world. I mean, if we take, for example, the infant mortality in Afghanistan at birth is 46 deaths per 1,000. Now, compared to Iran, which is a neighboring country, with 13 deaths among children rather than 46. In Sweden, of course, advanced countries, only 2.6 mortalities per 1,000. If we come to maternal mortality, that women who die while giving birth or as a complications of birth, the rate in Afghanistan is 638 mothers die out of 100,000 births. In Iran, it's only 16. In Sweden, it's only 4. So we have a huge loss of life in Afghanistan, not as a result of the war directly, but indirectly because of the lack of healthcare to provide to the women, children, and elder and everyone in that country. So I think this health Silk Road could be one of the, because you can intervene immediately now. You know, can use the same airport in Kabul, which people have used for people fleeing the country. You can land medical aid, vaccines, and so on into Afghanistan, not just leaving Afghanistan, but bringing things into Afghanistan, which would be very, very important step in stabilizing the situation there and giving people some hope. But I guess you had some things, you told me some things about Afghanistan and China and the healthcare.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with your statements. Yeah, I just wanted people to understand how China thinks. This is, and everyone said, well, gee, look how China's reaching out to Afghanistan. Well, I just, before the record, China built its first hospital in Afghanistan in 1975. It's in southern Afghanistan. It's near Kandahar, and across it's a 600-bed hospital. Yes. Right. Now, and it has been the subject of rocket fire and missile launch, et cetera, it was rebuilt in 1996 and managed by the International Red Cross. But even to this day, it still has funding and support from China. In fact, this hospital, which is called the Chinese Hospital in Afghanistan, still last year was used with for COVID, a specific COVID ward. That's number one, and that's the largest hospital in that area. But what I also really didn't look at until I got further into this is in Kabul. So the largest hospital in Kabul was also founded in 1975, but completely rebuilt by China from the ground up in 2000, from 2004 to 2006. It's 10 stories, 350 beds across all different disciplines and economies, and medical equipment. So China itself, largest in Kabul, largest in Kandahar, and they've been doing this for 45 years. This just didn't happen overnight, and 950 beds. So I just want people to think that, you know, China is not charging in to grab minerals. This is a long-standing, nearly 50-year relationship, because people don't think this way in the West. So I just wanted to share this couple of bits. So thank you for allowing me to do so.
Yeah, well, thank you, Henry. It's always very enlightening and informative to discuss with you. So hopefully this health Silk Road question does not remain as a Chinese matter, but that people here in Europe can also realize how important these ideas, this discussion, but also looking at the mechanisms, the way, the methods the Chinese have used to develop this concept. And this is quite useful. So I thank you again, Henry, for joining us, for taking some of your valuable time to address our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and keep going with what you're doing. Well done.
Thank you very much. And hopefully we will come back soon with more podcasts and more interesting material concerning the Belt and Road Initiative and how it's advancing and what are its benefits. Thank you for joining us.
We do plan these every 6 months to show everyone how this is moving quickly, because I think we'll plan this with China every 6 months as an update. So
that's a very good idea. We come back again, and because we traced it since our first podcast with you, we are tracing this development, so we have updates and to see if these things are happening or not, where they're heading, and where the Silk Road is leading. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.